Hello and welcome back to All You Need Notes for Edexcel IGCSE History, and this is the last in a series of videos on Germany 1918 to 45, dealing with Germany in the occupied territories during the Second World War. In this series I look at two effects of everything on the specification to help you specifically for question B, but the information is really helpful for question C and question A even too. So we'll begin now with racial policies towards the Jews. The ghettos. The first effect of the ghettos was that many Jews suffered in them. Jews were crammed into these so-called Jewish quarters in cities with poor and crowded housing, and about 4,000 died per month in 1941 due to disease and starvation spreading very, very quickly. So typhus spread quickly, starvation was rife because food was restricted. The Jews had to pay for a variety of different things in the ghetto, like the walls surrounding it, so they were trapped in and they had to pay for the conditions they were put in. A second effect was that they could now be easily transported to concentration camps. So because they were all gathered together in specific areas of the city, they could be resettled easily to the concentration camps in the final solution, which we'll find out a bit about soon. So over 250,000 Jews from Warsaw in Poland were taken to camps in eastern Poland to work, to do forced labour or to be killed. And in total, because they could be transported easily, 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust in extermination camps like Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Second one then is death squads. The first effect of this was that they killed many Eastern Europeans. So when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, thousands came under Nazi rule, and these death squads, composing of soldiers, rounded up Jewish men, women, children, and they shot and gassed them. They killed 1.2 million Soviet citizens by 1943, a huge amount, and they buried them in mass graves. A second effect was that the Nazis killed any other undesirables. So death squads were used to kill other political opponents in the Soviet Union in order to purify the population. So communist leaders, obviously communism was directly opposed to Nazism, these leaders were killed as well. So were gypsies, anyone who went against Nazi ideology. And the soldiers would remove valuables from their corpses, like jewellery, watches, clothes, so profiting from killing people. And the final solution then. So the first effect of this was that Jews were sent to concentration camps in order to do forced labour. So people who were fit enough to work were forced to work all day for very, very little food, for inadequate accommodation. Just like the ghettos, disease was rife, lots and lots of starvation. And they were forced to work in fields or to build buildings, all of this in order to help the war effort. And they were subject to experimentation in some of the camps and to frequent beatings and just horrible conditions. Second effect was that undesirables and people who were deemed unfit for work were killed. So from when the final solution was implemented in January 1942, the Nazis killed 6 million Jews at these extermination camps. In addition to this, 5 million gypsies, homosexuals, priests, disabled people, etc., they were also killed, and again their valuables, hair, teeth, glasses, were taken from their bodies. The Nazis used propaganda to try and show these camps as having good conditions, so they lied to the public, and so Germans and even some Jews were happy to help run the camps and support the camps and help transport Jews to them. Moving on to a different topic then, the changing role of women. The first effect of this was that women were reluctantly encouraged to return to the workforce. So Nazi policies meant that women were meant to be good mothers. They were encouraged to look after the household, have lots of children, and so the amount of women at work decreased from 1929 to 1939. However, in June 1941, Goering ordered all childless women who had previously been in employment to go back to work and help with the war effort. In 1943, total war, which we'll see on the next slide, total war was declared, And this meant that all women aged 17 to 45 were forced to register to work. And by 1945, women made up 60% of the labour force. So there were more women in work than men. And the second effect was that women helped with the war effort. So total war essentially meant that Germany was committed to victory. So their economy became entirely war-driven. And so by 1943, 500,000 more women were working in industry in Germany. Many were involved in auxiliaries for the armed forces, so they would operate searchlights and anti-aircraft guns in order to stop the Allies and Allied planes. Nazi propaganda was used, so it was used to encourage women to see the Soviets as brutish, who would come over and destroy Germany and rape them. And they were encouraged, therefore, to help the war effort to stop the Soviets coming and to ensure Germany won. So, the policy of total war then. The first effect was that many citizens were encouraged to work in order to help the war effort. So, Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of the Soviet Union, failed. And Goebbels told Germans that they had now entered total war. So Germany was now committed to victory. The whole economy was now war-driven. So this involved a variety of different policies, but prisoners of war in concentration camps had to help work, and 7 million were used as slave labour by 1944. Men aged 16 to 65 and women aged 17 to 45 had to work as well in order to help the war effort. Holidays were limited, the work hours were increased, so people were doing more work with less time off. So again, just really making sure really trying to make Germany win. Second effect was that all unnecessary services were shut down. So sports teams and places of entertainment were closed so that people could focus on work, for the war. But places like cinemas did remain open just for propaganda reasons. The postal service was reduced in order to save on fuel, which was rationed and in short supply. And a home guard was established, so a variety of different ages of people, including boys as young as 12, often from the Hitler Youth, were encouraged to help defend Germany and to train for if the Allies came and invaded Germany. Small businesses which weren't essential were closed as well, so that their employees could do proper war work. Rationing then. So the first effect of this was that products were limited. So from August 1939, food stamps were introduced to buy food because there would be blockages and shortages. So there were stamps introduced to buy meat, dairy products, soap, and from November, clothing restrictions were also brought in. People had a very, very basic level of nutrition, so they could still survive on it, but it wasn't ideal, it wasn't nice, and so many turned to the black market in order to get proper supplies. And the theft of food stamps was a very, very serious punishment. You could go to labour camp for it. Second effect was that there was a shortage of products. So tobacco for smoking, that was rare, and there was a shortage of that, and this was actually used to trade for other goods because it was that rare. There were also shortages of toilet paper, and from 1939 to 40, in the winters, there were shortages of coal and shoes, so people were very, very cold, they were very, very unhappy with how things were going. And in May 1942, the government were forced to cut rations even further, so it led to only half a loaf of bread per person per day, and just 40 grams of meat, for example. Allied bombing. The first effect was that German morale deteriorated. So the RAF, as well as the American Air Force, they bombed civilian targets in Germany, for example, cities with large populations, in order to try and destroy, completely eradicate German morale. So, as an example, between March and July 1943, 43 cities were bombed. This damaged houses, buildings, schools, hospitals, etc. And as an example, in Hamburg, 42,600 people died as a result of bombing. The government tried to use propaganda to increase morale. They set up welfare organisations to try and help people who were being dislocated because of the bombing, but many still felt the strains and the struggle of war very, very strongly, and they were dissatisfied with what was going on. A second effect was that war production was decreased. So from 1944, the Allies also began to focus on different targets like railway lines, bridges, motorways, so all the transport links in Germany. They did bombing raids on the Ruhr Valley, so remember the invasion of the Ruhr ages ago by the French. They did bombing raids on that valley. This valley had a lot of metal supplies, so it reduced metal production by 40%. This meant there was less metal for guns, for example. And because they destroyed railway lines, they stopped trains being able to take goods from German cities and factories to the front line. War production was only reduced by 1%, which is still quite a bit, but many goods still made it to the front line. Some were stopped, but it did have little effect on war production. Now we have a look at opposition to the Nazi regime, beginning with the Edelweiss Pirates. So many youths engaged in anti-Nazi activities. So they daubed graffiti on the walls, criticising the Nazis. They would listen to forbidden music in the association called the Pirates. Boys and girls would mix, which was banned essentially in the Hitler Youth. By 1939, there were 2,000 members. It had started in the Rhineland, it had grown. It was very loosely organised. It wasn't a fixed society, it was more local and sort of gangs of children. But they objected to military conscription. They also hated members of the Hitler Youth. They would bully and beat them up because they hated all the military training. So they were very opposed to the Hitler Youth. And they did help the Allies. So they would shelter any army deserters, so people who'd run away from the army, escaped prisoners from the concentration camps. They even distributed Allied propaganda, like leaflets. When rationing increased in 1942, they stole food from trains. They also stole guns to decrease war production. They smashed factories that were creating war goods. And because they were so loosely organised, and there weren't many of them, and it was all in certain regions, the pirates were never a serious threat to the Nazis. But in Cologne, in Germany, several young people, as part of the pirates, were publicly hanged in 1944, which showed that they did pose some sort of threat, and they were made an example of to try and show German people that they shouldn't be going against the regime. The next group we look at is the White Rose group. So the first effect of the White Rose group was that leaflets were sent out to spread anti-Nazi messages. So Hans and Sophie Scholl, these are the main people in the group, but there were many, many others as well. In 1941, in Munich, when they were at university, they printed anti-Nazi messages. They would send them to lecturers at the university, they would send them to local business owners, and in these they criticised the Nazis. They promoted democracy and the return of the Weimar Republic. They said that Hitler and Germany were going to be defeated in the war, there was no hope, and they campaigned strongly against the war. They wanted it to stop. They really disliked the persecution of the Jews. They wanted to make this message known. They daubed graffiti on the walls in Munich. And the second effect was that the Nazis made an example of them. So in 1943, they began to leave the leaflets in more prominent places, like the university itself. But while they were doing this, Sophie was seen throwing leaflets from a balcony. And the Gestapo arrested them and tortured them, and eventually they confessed to treason against the Nazis and against Hitler. And so they were executed in private, and 80 other associates who were involved in it, they were arrested too. It was the Nazis made an example of them to remind the public not to go against the Nazis. And this is a common theme throughout all the rebellions against Hitler. The final one we look at is the July bomb plot. So the first effect of this was that the army were now seen to be dissatisfied with the war. So on the 20th of July 1944, von Stauffenberg, who was a colonel in the army, he was one of several officers who saw that Germany was going to be defeated soon. And they wanted to put a stop to Hitler because they thought he was ruining Germany's chances. So von Stauffenberg took a bomb in a briefcase to a meeting that he was having with Hitler. He went out and the bomb detonated, but Hitler wasn't killed, he survived it. The group that he was involved in, they wanted to take control of Berlin, they wanted to put up a new government, but because Hitler was still alive, they weren't able to. So the second effect was that thousands of the conspirators were killed or arrested. So von Stauffenberg himself was shot for his involvement in it, and Himmler, who was in charge of the SS, he was put in charge also of rounding up all the plotters. 7,000 people were arrested. This included many senior officials in the Nazi regime. It showed just how wide the anti-Hitler sentiments were in Germany. And thousands of these were executed, including 19 generals and 27 colonels. It just showed how high up the ranks in the army there was dissatisfaction with Hitler, with what was happening. But they were made an example of, and it was put a stop to. The final part of the specification then. Hitler's death. The first effect was that morale was lost. So Germany was being squeezed. The British forces, but the Allied forces, were advancing from the west, from the direction of France. The Soviets were advancing from the east, from Eastern Europe, and they were closing in on Germany, and defeat just seemed imminent. Nazi propaganda, as we've looked at before, this showed the Soviets as brutish, and many became scared of a potential invasion by the Soviets. Resources ran low, so the Allies continued bombing, but bombing German cities, and 1 million died from hunger, disease, and just general cold. There were horrible conditions there. So morale was certainly lost. And Hitler, obviously, a huge figure in Germany. He was seen as a figurehead. He was seen as such a sign of hope for many, many Germans that they would win, and that they could win, and that the war would be over soon. He was gone. Morale evaporated. The second effect was that Germany very, very quickly surrendered to the Allies. So as we said, it was squeezed from both sides. It wasn't going to be able to resist. They were both advancing in on Berlin, and the end looked inevitable. And many people did put up a good fight. So there was the Home Guard that we looked at. More German troops actually died in the last 4 months of the war than in 1942 and 43. So they did fight hard, they did try to defend Germany. But Hitler committed suicide on the 30th of April 1945. Just how you remember the date. There are lots of things associated with Hitler that happened on the 30th. So he became Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. The Night of the Long Knives happened on the 30th of June 1934. And Hitler died on the 30th of April 1945. And with him gone, the Germans very, very quickly surrendered. So the Allies continued to advance, and Germany surrendered on the 7th of May 1945 to the Allies. And so the Third Reich came to an end. And that is the end of all you need notes for Edexcel IGCSE History on Germany 1918 to 45. I hope you found this episode and, well, this entire series helpful for your revision, and this was on Germany and occupied territories during the Second World War. Thank you for watching. I am going to be doing one on the Cold War topic, the superpower relations, so please like and subscribe if you want to see that, as well as some videos on how to answer paper 1 of history. So thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.